close enough.
Welcome back, everybody. This is Sherman with Mutual Omaha. Welcome back to Guest in the West show. Excited to have an attorney. This is the first one on the show. Patrick Daniel, please introduce yourself.
Hey, Patrick Daniel from Patrick Daniel Law. Happy to be here. I don't know if it's good to be the first or the last attorney, but we're here regardless.
So there's a myriad of different areas to focus on
Sure.
in law. Patrick, what do you guys focus on at your firm?
We do plaintiff's personal injury. We have a products liability-based focus on our practice. We do what's called catastrophic litigation, complex mostly, which means it's going to be the non-ordinary auto wreck. So if a guy's out there doing normal work or something and he gets injured as a consequence of a defective product, or if somebody is out there, we, for example, had a case that came in the other day where a guy's on a construction site and some equipment is defective and injures and ultimately kills him. So we do a variety of different things. Now, do we handle car wrecks? Yes, we do. But our focus is on the things that most people are incapable or not equipped to handle, whether it's intellectually or financially or strategically. Our belief is strategic, meticulous, and merciless. As a consequence, we handle things that we think are usually others would not look to as ordinary and capable of being resolved expeditiously. We are willing to put in the time, the hours, the manpower to resolve stuff over the course of a significant period of time if that's what it takes.
Gotcha. And you mentioned that you practice law in Texas, but where else do you practice?
We have cases filed across the country,
Okay.
from California to New Jersey. We have stuff in virtually, I don't want to say every state because that would probably be a little overzealous, but we have stuff from Arizona, Minnesota that I can think of, Wisconsin. We have a lot in Louisiana. We have stuff across the South. We practice in virtually every jurisdiction.
And what does that look like in today's unprecedented times?
We've had to do a bit of rescheduling, to say the least, with the travel bans that existed in a variety of different places. I was explaining to you earlier, I have a hearing via Zoom in Louisiana next week. I have a mediation that's in person this week. Court by court, it's kind of different, certainly state by state. Courts within certain jurisdictions that don't have live in person, they're willing to do, based on the judge's preference, a Zoom hearing, for example. Texas actually conducted the first Zoom trial this week in the country. It's interesting because you got to have consent of both sides to make it binding. Obviously, from a plaintiff's perspective, from my client's perspective, we're willing to do those sorts of things because we want resolution more quickly. The defendants don't always want that. They want the time value of money. It's the sort of thing where we're flexible, and you have to be flexible in today's age. I flew to the Valley this week to go do some work. That was the first time I had flown since the COVID epidemic occurred. It was interesting.
Yeah, what is that flight like, Patrick?
Because
Because you're still in Texas.
No, of course.
Right on the border. So
yeah, it was interesting from the perspective of first at the airport. Every terminal was closed for security except for Terminal C at Bush. So I went to Terminal E where I was flying and was rerouted to Terminal C. I was surprised there was about 75 people or so in the security line. The security measures, I was honestly, I was a little concerned. They weren't more significant than they were. You were just kind of running people right through there, but it worked out fine. But everybody on the planes is required to wear a mask.
okay.
They encourage you to do it. I think it's kind of the same principles that are applying in most of the environment out there. Wear
Okay.
your mask if you can wear a mask. Social distance. For example, the planes now have no middle seats for people. They're blocked off. You can sit every other. So that was
this can
interesting.
be nice. A little more legroom.
Yeah. That aisle seat is always appreciated, but now even a window seat gets some legroom. So yeah, it's good.
And then so when you went down there, what was the court like? Was that still via Zoom, or how did they do that with social distancing?
I was actually down there meeting with some clients, so
Okay.
I didn't go to court.
Okay.
The courts in Texas have been basically closed.
Okay.
The courts, I do a lot of work in Wisconsin. I was supposed to be in trial this week in Wisconsin. That was obviously off. Louisiana, same thing, that hearing that's coming up. I have one that's set in another jurisdiction. I'm trying to think of where it is. It's also been bumped. They're kind of retooling things. The whole court process now, you have to submit evidence in advance of a hearing, which is very different. I don't usually love to tip my hand about things, but you kind of have to become strategic in a different way, I guess, utilize a new formula. But that's pretty akin to going to trial. You can prepare for most everything, but you always have to react and counteract things that occur during trial. So I think it'll be a lesson for all trial lawyers. In our firm, we are trial lawyers. We try cases. We actually go to court and do those things. I was in trial for 5 weeks earlier this year. It's the sort of thing that preparation is probably more important now than it previously has been. I think if anything, COVID gave us an opportunity to catch up on some stuff that we were probably behind on. But it's been, a learning experience like I think it has for everybody else across the country.
And so I know that every state has their own kind of reopening plan. Are any of them opened up their courts yet, or are most of them still doing it via Zooms?
I got a hearing notice the other day, and we called yesterday to figure out for Wisconsin if it was in person, because it's a guardianship hearing for a client of mine with a brain injury. I don't know, because they didn't answer yet. But my suspicion is it's going to be Zoom, but Wisconsin is kind of a fickle mistress because they just struck down their governor's order relative to preventing the reopening of things. So it's kind of the Wild West, for lack of a better way to say it. Louisiana's been pretty strict, as you know, because they had so many COVID cases with the quarantine from entering and exiting. So every state is a little bit independent, but I have not been back to court. And I honestly don't know anybody that's been to court in a fashion other than Zoom recently. We had one hearing scheduled for via Zoom over the course of time, and it's a little awkward, The other thing is they've begun to settle cases via Zoom. So, and we'd be sitting here just like we're doing with the podcast, speaking to people in other jurisdictions and other areas. And, that's kind of nice from a travel perspective. I don't have to fly nearly as much as I used to. I used to spend about 2 days out of the week on an airplane. I don't have to do that anymore. And for those people that are like me, it's good and bad. I like to be there. I'm kind of tangible. I think most lawyers that are trial lawyers like to be there in front of someone. I guess we all think we're more convincing.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's part of the sizzle, right, Patrick?
That's maybe just my perspective on it. But that's the sort of thing that makes it easier to kind of touch people and kind of relate to people. I think that's the sort of thing that is going to be really, really difficult for those of us that are trial lawyers coming up. I think you're going to learn to have to adjust and learn to touch people. I think ultimately it's going to make those of us that are able to be resilient and study and change how we do things a little bit better lawyers, both in the courtroom and out of the courtroom in other fashions, because I think you're going to have to teach yourself to relate to people better.
Yeah, especially when you're doing it via electronically, right, and trying to connect to someone, where it's a lot easier face-to-face to be able to have that physical connection.
Sure. If you and I, for example, were conducting this from my office to here, we wouldn't have that connection that we would have while I'm sitting here and being able to kind of address things off the air, that sort of thing, get to know one another. And I think those are the important losses from this that I think people that don't ordinarily go into a courtroom aren't going to initially understand. For those of us that try cases and go to court a lot, it's the sort of connection that you lose initially. So I think there's going to have to be different ways to rebuild those connections.
So how do you keep in touch with all of the various jurisdiction rules on various states? Is that like a time all on its own?
Well, every state but Louisiana has electronic filing. So interestingly enough, you'll get orders from the various bar associations. Those will come via email. You check periodically. Jurisdictions that you practice in a great deal, you're going to be updated on as well. But yeah, you have to actually perform. It's kind of like everything else, the way I look at practicing law. You're only as good as the effort that you put forth. So as a consequence, my staff checks that all the time. I freaked out because I was like, oh my goodness. I was like, where am I supposed to be today in Wisconsin? And then I realized it was a trial that we had not removed from one of the calendars. So yeah, being on top of stuff is obviously critically important. We do our job and we try to do our job as thoroughly as we can, which requires you to stay abreast of all the new developments in every jurisdiction. I'm licensed, for example, in 3 jurisdictions, Texas, Wisconsin, and Louisiana, but we practice everywhere. So if you've got cases filed in 30 states, you better be up and current on all 30 states, travel bans, corona bans, on everything that they've imposed with respect to how their state works, but then the court system as well. Because For example, I was watching something this morning about the NFL Players Association. They had a piece on Tom Brady beginning to open practices with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers receivers. Well, he's conducting it himself, but the point was ESPN had questioned, hey, is this okay? They said as long as he's following state, local, and NFL guidelines, he's fine. But it's a perfect example of something that's going and throwing the football with two other people requires you to abide by three different sets of regulations. And I think it's a lesson to all of us is that we're not governed exclusively by one set of rules. You stay in your house, you're governed by your mom and your dad or your parents, you know.
Yep.
You got that under control. But once you venture outside, you have a whole new set of things that you're going to have to look at and abide by and follow. And as we all know, it's the sort of thing that's intended to protect us, just like the rules and regulations that exist across the United States. So we have to stay current. We have to do our best to follow all those things while being respectful to everyone else, but also while trying to get the job done with whatever your job is. But in my case, certainly for my clients, because they come first and foremost.
And so, what the people kind of describe again? What is that client that might need to reach out to you?
That's, most of them have phones, whether they have the computer or otherwise. What we have done is we have tried to do a better job of checking in our clients. We're completely paperless, so we have a pretty good system from the time the case comes in as a lead, through the time it becomes a case, through the time the case is being managed through litigation. Our receptionist is busy, to say the least, answering a lot of phone calls, taking care of clients. I'll say this, we have gotten more requests for financial hardship than we've ever gotten in the past, which is sad. Yeah. These are people that already have usually lost a job due to a physical injury, and that's why they're coming to see you, and that's an element of the damages that they're seeking. But it's particularly hard when that other family member, for example, now also can't work, and your kids are at home without the ability to go to school, get educated. But one of the things I know that a lot of people had overlooked is that a lot of children in public schools counted on those meals at school. And the interesting thing is when neither parents are working, they may not always have the gas to go up there and pick those meals up. Yeah. So we've tried to do some things in our office, whether it's giving back. We've made masks and given them out to the homeless. We have made tamales on our social media broadcasts for teachers that were nominated to come on. I mean, we do a lot to try and give back, especially right now. It's tough to take care of people. I mean, it's tough to take care of your own family, much less somebody else's, but it's important that we recognize how difficult it is for one another. It's something in our industry that the longer you do it, on my side of the fence, the plaintiff's side, and you deal with your clients every day, you do have a tendency to become I've done it 20 years this year. It'll be 20 years this year, next year. I've been on my own 16. You kind of get jaded, but you always have to remember that you work for them and that they have bestowed upon you the most gracious and important gift that they have, which is their life and their livelihood. And I think as Americans, if I can remember it for what I do for a living, I think we need to remember it for one another and really try to take care of one another. And I think that's what we're trying to do. We put ourselves first, unfortunately, all the time. I think that's human nature, but I think if we can have even a weekly reminder to do something for someone else, I think it's important. Yeah.
Well, and it's unique. You're in a very a space where people come to you usually because there's a tragedy, right? Something difficult has happened that's occurred in their life. And that's when they need your expertise, right?
Yeah. Usually, interestingly enough, they've had a tragedy of some type. They're usually hurt and physically incapable of working. It's usually a laborer of some type, somebody that's not as intellectually as astute and educated as somebody else may be. But what's worse is they're usually put in the situation where they need to seek a lawyer because of how an insurance company, a claims handler, a risk manager in a self-insured entity has treated them. So they've kind of gotten stepped on twice by the time they get to me. That's usually the second factor, is usually the one that motivated them, how they were treated, ironically enough, to seek out counsel. And, it kind of dovetails with what I was talking about earlier. It's how you treat one another as human beings that's so important. And I think if we did more of that, I'd probably have a different practice than I have now. But I think we'd probably live in a happier place.